In the bustling heart of New York City's art district, where polished gallery windows reflected the shimmering light of high-rise buildings, a small, overlooked studio stood in stark contrast. The walls inside were lined with vibrant pieces, each a burst of color and emotion. Paintings that seemed to pulse with life, drawings that captured the complexities of human nature, and sculptures that defied the laws of physics. Yet, despite the artistic fervor displayed in every corner, the studio remained far from the spotlight. Miles had never been interested in fame. His art, his passion, and his craft had always been about something deeper, something that transcended the superficial allure of wealth and recognition. He had spent years honing his skills, crafting each piece with meticulous detail, each stroke of the brush telling a story only a few could understand. The truth was, not many had the eye to see the value of his work. And fewer still had the appreciation for the life experiences he wove into each canvas. But today was different. Today, Miles had received an invitation to showcase his art in one of the most prestigious galleries in the city, one that catered to the elite. The invitation had come from none other than Lucien Graves, the owner of Graves Gallery, an institution that was the epitome of New York's high society art scene. Miles had initially been hesitant. The gallery's reputation for exclusivity was both a blessing and a curse. It was a place where only the wealthiest patrons could afford the pieces, where art was often reduced to a commodity, and where many artists found their works lost in the sea of expensive trends. Yet, there was something undeniable about the opportunity. Being seen by the right eyes could change everything for him. Maybe, just maybe, this was the break he had been waiting for. When Miles arrived at Graves Gallery, he was immediately struck by the stark contrast between the cold, polished environment and the warmth of his own studio. The gallery was a showcase of sleek design, its walls adorned with a mix of famous works and trendy modern pieces that screamed sophistication. The energy in the air was electric, but it was a kind of sterile excitement. Art was not meant to be a living, breathing entity here, it was something to be controlled, confined, and sold. He was escorted to a private room where Lucien Graves himself awaited. The gallery owner, dressed in a tailored suit, stood with his back to the door, his hands clasped behind him as he studied one of the paintings on the wall. Lucien Graves had the kind of presence that made you immediately aware of his power, his face sharp, his gaze calculating. He was a man who had built his empire on the art of seeing value where others didn't. But as Miles would soon discover, Lucien had a very particular idea of what that value should look like. "Mr. Graves," Miles said, offering a polite smile as he stepped into the room. Lucien turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he took in Miles' appearance. There was something about him that didn't fit the image of a typical artist, or at least, not the one Lucien had in mind. Miles was tall and broad, his demeanor calm yet assertive, with a quiet strength that exuded confidence. His black attire seemed almost out of place against the backdrop of the gallery's pristine white walls and avant-garde art. He didn't look like the kind of artist who was used to being surrounded by high society. "You're Miles Turner, the artist," Lucien said, his voice smooth but lacking warmth. He extended a hand, his fingers long and pale. "I must admit, I'm surprised to see you here. Your work doesn't exactly fit the typical mold we showcase at Graves." Miles shook Lucien's hand, his expression neutral. He had heard about the gallery owner's reputation for being difficult to please, but he had hoped that Lucien might see something in his work that others hadn't. "I believe art is something that transcends categories," Miles replied, his voice steady. "I've always created with my heart, and I hope that's something you can appreciate." Lucien's lips twitched into a slight smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I'm sure you poured your heart into these," he said, stepping toward the canvas that hung in the center of the room. "But here at Graves, we deal with art that appeals to a more exclusive clientele. We focus on the high-end market, pieces that fetch a significant price and provide a certain prestige." He glanced at Miles, raising an eyebrow. "You see, not every piece can command that level of interest. Some work simply doesn't have the necessary commercial appeal." He motioned to the nearby paintings. "Take these for example, they're all the product of emerging artists. As much as I admire the enthusiasm, I'm afraid they simply don't have the caliber necessary for serious collectors. Miles felt a twinge of irritation but kept his composure. He had encountered similar dismissals before, especially in galleries where commercial value trumped artistic merit. But something about Lucien's tone, the way he dismissed the works without a second glance, reminded him of the kind of superficial thinking that had kept many black artists like him out of the limelight. "I see," Miles said, his voice cool. "Well, I didn't come here just to show you what I've done. I came here to show you what I can do." Lucien chuckled, the sound empty and insincere. "Oh, I'm sure. But in this business, it's not about what you can do, it's about what you've already done. And, frankly, I'm not convinced your work is going to make much of an impact." He paused for a moment, looking at Miles with a critical gaze. "But don't worry, I'm sure you'll find your niche somewhere. It might take time, but you'll get there. Perhaps a smaller gallery, something with more affordable tastes. Not everyone can make it here, but there are plenty of other avenues. Maybe you should look into showing in Brooklyn or something." He chuckled again, as if the suggestion was an afterthought. Miles stood still, his expression unreadable. It took all of his restraint not to react to Lucien's dismissive tone. He had known this kind of prejudice existed, but it still stung when it came from someone who prided himself on being an arbiter of culture. Lucien Graves was the kind of man who could turn the value of art into a mere transaction, reducing it to an equation based on what was popular, what could fetch the highest price. He knew what Lucien saw when he looked at him, a young black artist, with a style that didn't fit the mainstream art world's mold. To Lucien, Miles' work wasn't worth millions. To him, it wasn't even worth his time. But what Lucien didn't know was that Miles was about to shatter the very foundation of that belief. Miles left Graves' gallery that day, feeling a mix of disbelief and quiet determination. Lucien Graves' words still echoed in his mind, each dismissal ringing louder than the last. But rather than feeling defeated, something inside him ignited. He had been underestimated before, and it hadn't stopped him then, and it wouldn't stop him now. Lucien's arrogance had planted a seed, one that Miles would nurture into something far more powerful. What Lucien didn't know was that Miles wasn't the kind of artist who would fade into obscurity. His art, the pieces he had created over the years, were more than just paintings, they were investment-grade masterpieces, each one a culmination of years of study, travel, and reflection. But there was no room for artists like Miles in the gallery owner's world. No room for artists who didn't fit the narrow boundaries of what was in or popular. And Miles had come to realize that the world didn't deserve to see his work on his terms, not until it was ready. As he walked back to his small studio in Brooklyn, he couldn't help but think of the conversation that had just transpired. Lucien had made it clear that he saw no commercial value in Miles' pieces. What Lucien hadn't seen, however, was the history behind them, the stories embedded in every stroke, the journeys they had taken, the people who had influenced them. Miles' art wasn't just something to hang on a wall, it was an experience, a perspective that demanded to be understood. That evening, as he sat at his cluttered desk, Miles began to sift through old journals and letters. Each one detailed his time spent with mentors and peers, artists from all over the world, many of whom had recognized his extraordinary potential long before the critics. He recalled the late-night sessions, the countless hours of perfecting his technique, and the sense of purpose that had always driven him. But what Lucien Graves didn't know, what no one outside his inner circle knew, was that Miles wasn't just an artist. He was an artist with connections to some of the wealthiest art collectors in the world. In the months leading up to his visit to Graves' gallery, Miles had been working closely with a select group of investors and art buyers, each of whom had seen the true value of his work. He wasn't just a struggling artist anymore, he was a man with an eye for the future, and his work was rapidly becoming the next big thing on the global market. He had carefully cultivated a secret network of collectors who were more interested in the legacy of his pieces than the fleeting trends that dominated the galleries of Manhattan. It had all started with a quiet auction in Geneva. Miles had agreed to sell one of his pieces to a private collector for a significant sum, but he had no idea what kind of ripple effect it would create. The painting, an abstract representation of African diaspora and cultural identity, had quickly gained the attention of art aficionados who had begun bidding on it as though it were a rare artifact. When the auction concluded, Miles was stunned to learn that the piece had sold for well over $5 million, a price that far exceeded his expectations. The news had spread like wildfire through the art world, and within weeks, Miles' name was whispered with reverence in the same circles that had once only admired artists like Banksy and Koons. His work, once seen as emerging, was now considered essential. And what Lucien Graves had dismissed as unimpressive was suddenly the subject of heated debates in high society art auctions across Europe and Asia. It wasn't long before collectors began approaching him with serious offers for his entire collection, recognizing that Miles' pieces were more than just art, they were an investment. Miles knew the true worth of his work. He understood that the market had underestimated him, and now it was time to cash in on the opportunity he had been carefully crafting. One evening, after a particularly lengthy negotiation with a group of international investors, Miles received an unexpected call. It was from a well-known art critic, Eleanor Blackstone, whose reviews and endorsements were highly sought after in the industry. She was intrigued by the sudden surge in interest surrounding his work and wanted to write an in-depth article about him for Art World Journal, a prestigious publication that had the power to elevate an artist to legendary status. "Mr. Turner," Eleanor's voice crackled through the phone. "I've seen the bids on your work, and I must say, I'm impressed. I'm writing an article on the new wave of contemporary art, and I believe your story would be the centerpiece. This could be your breakthrough moment." Miles felt his heart race. Eleanor's endorsement would only add fuel to the fire that was already burning beneath his career. "I appreciate your interest, Eleanor," he replied, his voice steady. "But I think it's time for me to take a different direction. I want the world to see my work on my terms. It's time for the right people to understand its value." Eleanor seemed intrigued by his response. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking of a very public reveal," Miles said, feeling the weight of his words. "I want to show the world just what they've been missing. It's time for the art world to catch up with me." By now, the art world had been watching Miles closely. It was only a matter of time before the story would break wide open. His work had not only become a symbol of cultural importance, but it was now seen as one of the most sought-after collections on the market. His paintings had become more than just canvases, they were the embodiment of a new era of black art, a fusion of history, identity, and innovation that resonated deeply with collectors. Meanwhile, Lucien Graves had no idea what was coming. The gallery owner's dismissive attitude towards Miles and his work had made him an easy target for those who had been paying attention to the rising star. As Graves continued to boast about his exclusive gallery, oblivious to the storm brewing, the art world's collective focus was shifting. And soon, the pieces that Graves had once snubbed would be hanging in the most prestigious collections across the globe, fetching millions, while Graves would be left behind, having missed the wave entirely. Miles' carefully orchestrated plan was starting to take shape. He had already received offers for his entire collection, but he wasn't ready to settle for anything less than what he deserved. The time had come for him to not just be a celebrated artist, but to become the one who controlled the game. And as the story of his meteoric rise began to unfold, Lucien Graves would soon discover just how badly he had misjudged the value of Miles Turner's art. The pieces that the gallery owner had mocked would soon be worth more than Graves could ever dream. Lucien Graves paced back and forth in his office, a glass of aged scotch in his hand, but his mind was far from the smooth, amber liquid. For the past several weeks, he had been watching the art market with increasing unease. The name Miles Turner kept popping up in the most unexpected places, articles, auctions, even on the lips of collectors he knew well. It was as if a tidal wave had come out of nowhere, sweeping through the art world, and Lucien, for once, had been caught off guard. His first encounter with Miles had left him with a sense of superiority. Lucien was used to seeing the world through a lens of exclusivity. He had built his gallery by catering to the tastes of the rich and powerful, curating what was considered high art and turning away anything that didn't fit within the narrow boundaries of his vision. He had dismissed Miles as another unknown artist, a name that would soon fade into obscurity, just like so many others who had come through his doors. He had made it clear that Miles' work had no place in Graves' gallery, but something about the artist's quiet confidence lingered in his mind, gnawing at him. It wasn't long before Lucien realized that he had made a colossal mistake. The shift began slowly at first. News spread that a private auction for one of Miles' paintings had fetched an astronomical price, $5 million, far more than Lucien would have ever expected for something he had once called unimpressive. He had brushed it off at the time, attributing it to the whims of a few eccentric buyers, but the more he looked into it, the more he saw that the buzz around Miles wasn't just a passing fad, it was the beginning of something much bigger. Over the next few weeks, Lucien began to notice his own clients speaking about Miles in hushed tones, with a sense of reverence. High-profile investors and art collectors, people who had once shown no interest in work from emerging artists, were suddenly clamoring for Miles' paintings. Even more surprising was the fact that these buyers weren't just interested in his work, they were offering to buy entire collections, bidding for anything and everything associated with the artist. Lucien felt his grip on the art world slipping, but it wasn't until he received an invitation to another private auction, this time for a series of Miles Turner's paintings, that the gravity of the situation truly sank in. The auction was set to take place in Paris, and the guest list was a who's who of the most influential figures in the art world. Lucien knew he had to be there, but his reasons were not entirely professional. He needed to see for himself just how far Miles had come, and just how much he had missed. As the date of the auction approached, Lucien found himself spiraling into doubt. He couldn't shake the image of Miles' calm, composed demeanor when he had rejected him in Graves' gallery. That unshakable confidence in the face of rejection. Had Lucien misjudged him so completely? The night of the auction, Lucien arrived in Paris, and the atmosphere was electric. The gallery hosting the event was opulent, a lavish space that could have been mistaken for a palace rather than a showcase for art. The guests sipped champagne and discussed art with the kind of ease that only comes from wealth and privilege, while paintings, Miles' paintings, hung on the walls like rare jewels, ready to be sold to the highest bidder. Lucien moved through the room, his eyes scanning the crowd for familiar faces, but it wasn't until he saw a piece of Miles' art that the weight of the moment truly hit him. The painting was a breathtaking depiction of cultural struggle, vibrant with a raw energy that captured the human condition in a way that Lucien had never seen before. It was art that spoke to the soul, something that transcended trends and elitism. Something that couldn't be dismissed so easily. As the auctioneer began, the room fell silent. The bids for Miles' paintings came in faster than Lucien could process, each one outpacing the last by millions. The final price for one of Miles' pieces reached $15 million, a sum that made Lucien's heart skip. This was no longer just an auction, it was a battleground for art and money, and Miles had emerged as the victor. Lucien stood at the back of the room, a cold sweat forming on his brow as he realized that he had made a grave error. He had turned away an artist whose value far surpassed anything he had ever imagined. This wasn't just about art anymore. This was about the power of recognition, of seeing beyond the surface and understanding the true worth of a creator. As the auction came to a close and the final paintings were sold for staggering sums, Lucien felt his doubts turn to regret. How had he missed this? How had he been so blinded by his own arrogance that he couldn't see the potential of Miles' work? The name Miles Turner was now on the tip of every collector's tongue, and Lucien realized that his gallery, once at the pinnacle of the art world, had missed the chance to be part of something much bigger. His gallery was known for showcasing the best, but now, it seemed, he was being left behind. The next morning, Lucien sat at his desk, reviewing the final numbers from the auction. He had spent his career positioning himself as an authority on art, and yet he felt like a fool. He had not only failed to recognize a rising star, but he had also made a mockery of someone whose art was changing the very landscape of the industry. Lucien knew that this was more than just a missed opportunity, it was a complete miscalculation. As he thought about how to recover, one thought kept gnawing at him. What if I could still get in on this? What if he could somehow bring Miles' work to his gallery? It wasn't too late to make amends, was it? Lucien picked up the phone, his fingers trembling slightly as he dialed the number he knew by heart, the number to Miles Turner's studio. The call rang out several times before it was answered. "Miles Turner," came the calm, steady voice on the other end. "Miles, it's Lucien Graves," he said, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I think we need to talk." Lucien Graves leaned back in his leather chair, staring at the phone in his hand as if willing it to reveal the answers he so desperately needed. It had been a week since his call to Miles Turner, a week filled with anticipation, regret, and a growing sense of dread. He had hoped that by reaching out to Miles, he could salvage his reputation, restore his place as the gatekeeper of the art world. But so far, Miles hadn't returned his call. It was almost laughable, really. Lucien had spent his entire career cultivating relationships with the most powerful figures in the art world, and yet here he was, groveling for the attention of an artist he had once dismissed so easily. The irony of it all wasn't lost on him, but the deeper he sank into his own guilt, the more determined he became to rectify his mistake. He couldn't let the world see him as a fool, not after all he had built. Miles had made it clear that he was no longer the struggling artist who needed the validation of galleries like Graves. He was a force in the art world now, a name that commanded attention in auction houses, in private sales, and in the upper echelons of the art market. Lucien had seen the numbers, the astronomical prices his works were fetching, and the whispering buzz of respect that had transformed Miles from a nobody into the most talked-about name in contemporary art. But Lucien wasn't one to give up so easily. He knew that the art world was fickle, that tastes changed and trends were fleeting. If he could just convince Miles to come back to him, to allow Graves' gallery to showcase his pieces, he could still be a part of this phenomenon. He needed to prove that he wasn't the one who had been left behind. His phone rang, snapping him from his thoughts. Without looking at the screen, he answered. "Lucien Graves," he said tersely. "Mr. Graves," a voice on the other end said, calm and authoritative. "This is Eleanor Blackstone. I'm writing an article on the rising stars of the art world, and I'd like to feature Miles Turner's work in it. I understand you've had some history with him. Do you think you could provide some insight into his journey?" Lucien's pulse quickened at the mention of Miles' name. This was the break he'd been waiting for, the opportunity to get back into the conversation. Eleanor Blackstone's articles were legendary, and a mention of Graves' gallery would undoubtedly restore his position in the art world. But as much as he wanted to bask in the glory of this new opportunity, a small voice in his head reminded him that things weren't as simple as they used to be. "Miles Turner, you say?" Lucien asked, feigning casual interest. "Well, yes, I certainly know of him. I've seen his work evolve over the years. He's quite talented." "Quite talented," Eleanor said, amused. "I'd say extraordinarily talented would be a more apt description. His pieces have become a sensation. The bidding wars are unbelievable. Have you been following the auctions?" Lucien's throat tightened. "Yes, of course. I've been watching his progress with interest." He hesitated, unsure how much to reveal, knowing how fragile his standing was. Miles' work is very unique. It's become clear that he has a vision that resonates with a lot of people. I must admit, I didn't fully understand it at first. "Well, that's why I'm calling," Eleanor said, her voice laced with intrigue. "I'm hoping you can shed some light on how someone like Miles, who once flew under the radar, has suddenly become a sensation. I'd love to hear about your personal experiences with him. What made you decide not to represent him initially?" Lucien swallowed hard. This wasn't just a casual conversation, it was a chance for him to either redeem himself or further solidify his reputation as a gallery owner who had failed to recognize talent when it was right in front of him. He paused, weighing his words carefully. "Miles is a remarkable artist," Lucien began slowly, trying to sound more convincing. "But when he came to me, I didn't think his work would fit the direction I was taking with the gallery. He had a rawness to his style that I didn't think would resonate with our clientele. We're focused on a very specific market, and at the time, I didn't see a place for him. I misjudged the potential of his work." Eleanor's silence on the other end of the line felt like an eternity. Lucien held his breath, waiting for her reaction. Finally, she spoke. "You misjudged him," Eleanor repeated, her voice tinged with amusement. "It seems that's been the consensus, doesn't it?" "Look, I'm not here to make you feel worse than you already do, Lucien. But I'll be honest with you, I think you missed a golden opportunity. This isn't just a fluke. Miles is changing the game. And now, it's about more than just his art, it's about cultural relevance. It's about history, identity, and the broader movement he's a part of." Lucien felt a knot form in his stomach. He could feel the walls closing in on him. He had let an opportunity slip through his fingers, and now, he was on the outside, desperately trying to get back in. "Thank you for your insight," Eleanor continued, her tone softening. "I'll make sure to mention Graves' gallery in my article, but I think it would be wise for you to reach out to Miles and see if you can work together. The art world is watching. And I'm sure you don't want to miss out on being a part of it." Lucien could feel his heart pounding. He needed to act fast. If Eleanor's article hit the press and mentioned his name in connection with Miles' success, he would have a chance to reclaim his position. But if he continued to wait, if he failed to reach out to Miles again, he would be the one left behind. Lucien stood up, a sudden surge of frustration rising within him. "I've built an empire on creating opportunities for artists, Miles. I've curated shows that have made history. You think I don't know how to create a meaningful experience? I've been doing this for years." Miles' eyes narrowed, and for a moment, there was silence. Then he spoke, his voice low and steady. "You don't get it, Lucien. It's never been about you. This is my vision. My art. You're just here to help me make it happen. But if you can't get on board with that, if you can't respect the process, then maybe this partnership isn't going to work." The words hit Lucien harder than he expected. In that moment, all the years of success, the years of playing the art world like a game, seemed meaningless. He had come to this point to make money, yes, but also to leave a legacy. But Miles? Miles wasn't interested in legacies or business deals. He was interested in truth. And in that truth, there was no room for ego or convention. "I understand," Lucien said, his voice softer now, almost defeated. "I'll make the changes. Whatever it takes." But even as he said the words, Lucien knew that something had shifted. This wasn't just about the exhibition anymore. It was about control. It was about who held the power in this partnership, and it was becoming clear that it wasn't him. The opening night. The night of the exhibition arrived, and Graves' gallery was filled with the most elite figures in the art world. Lucien had meticulously organized every detail, from the lighting to the press invitations, ensuring that this event would be the talk of the industry. But as he walked through the gallery, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't entirely in control. The installations were unlike anything he had ever seen, immersive, disorienting, and deeply personal. The audience was enveloped in an experience where they didn't just observe art, they became part of it. It was impossible to tell where the art ended and the audience began. Miles' vision had taken shape in ways that exceeded Lucien's expectations. But as Lucien moved through the crowd, he could see the unease on some of the faces. Some of the older patrons, the ones who had always been the foundation of Graves' gallery's success, seemed confused by the new direction. They weren't sure how to interact with the art. They weren't sure what to think. And then, in the center of the room, standing with a quiet confidence that made him seem like he was in his element, was Miles. He wasn't just the artist, he was the curator, the mastermind behind everything. He moved through the space with a sense of purpose, speaking softly to the guests who approached him, but never losing his focus on the bigger picture. Lucien approached him, his heart pounding. "It's working," he said, his voice tight with a mixture of awe and anxiety. "This is bigger than anything I've ever been a part of." Miles turned to him, his expression unreadable. "It's not just working, Lucien. It's changing everything. This isn't just an exhibition. This is a revolution. And you're part of it. But don't forget, you're not in charge of this. You never were. Lucien felt the weight of Miles' words. In that moment, he understood the true nature of their partnership. Miles wasn't just an artist he was representing, Miles had become a force of nature, one that Lucien couldn't control, only follow. As the night wore on, Lucien watched as the crowd buzzed with excitement, as critics raved about the exhibition, as collectors eagerly fought to secure their own pieces. Miles' art was no longer just something to be admired, it had become a movement, something that would define a generation. And Lucien? Lucien was no longer just the gallery owner. He was part of something bigger, something he had never fully understood before. He had been humbled, and in that humbling, he realized that the world of art had changed. It wasn't about owning it. It was about living it.